to do what they're supposed to be doing, which is teaching. And I think we all pat ourselves on the back and say, yeah, K through 12 is a problem, but we have the greatest higher education system in the world. I think that's a fundamentally flawed view. I don't think we do. I think we have serious problems in K through 12, in higher ed for what they're supposed to do, which is teach, and I think we need to be looking at that. So, what else do we need to do besides this? I think that one of the things we need to do, as I said, is create incentives for companies to locate high value added. Let me just suggest two possible ideas. One is what we've proposed as a knowledge tax credit. Right now, we were in 1990, we had the highest R&D tax credit in the world, the most generous tax treatment of research and development. Now we are 17th in OECD nations, largely because other nations have expanded theirs, but we've cut ours. I think one of the things we could do would be to create a new, what we've termed a knowledge tax credit, which would be to double the R&D tax credit, add a component to it for fixed expenses, not just incremental, and include in that credit workforce development expenditures. I think if we did that, and there's a big push to cut corporate tax rates as a way to be competitive. Personally, I think this is a better strategy. You get two bangs for the buck, if you will. You get reduced corporate costs so they can become more competitive, but you also do it in a way that incents them to build important building blocks of competitiveness, which two of those are skills and research. Let me just close by saying I find it sort of, I can never figure it out. I don't know if it's disingenuous or just intellectually inconsistent. When I hear free traders laud the wonders of free trade and the importance of markets, which I do, and yet simply defend foreign trade protectionism. The classic one would be Chinese currency manipulation. According to markets and trade theory, currency should be adjusted by supply and demand, and yet we seem in this country to be willing to accept those sorts of factors. I'm quite skeptical, by the way, that companies offshore R&D largely because of skills. I think it has a large factor to do with cost. There's a new IRI report that just came out about 2 weeks ago, if you haven't seen it, Industrial Research Institute, which actually says cost is the major reason why companies are offshoring R&D. And I think if we were to focus on some of these fairly serious mercantilist practices, I heard this morning, now that we're running a trade deficit with India as well, I guess the fact that they have 28% tariffs is acceptable, and that's all part of free trade. Or as Vinny pointed out, forced technology transfer. That seems to be acceptable as well. We've got a report coming out in about a month, tentatively called IT Mercantilism, where we document very systematic practices that everybody from Europe to Asia is doing to use unfair trade practices to go after exactly what it is we're good at, which is IT. And yet we seem as a country to sit there and basically accept that and say, well, these countries are poor, they get to do that. And yet we're running an $800 billion trade deficit, and somehow that seems to be okay. So I guess my view is these first steps are important, but unless we complement those with really serious efforts on the domestic side to create demand and much more aggressive efforts, and I agree with Vinny, the first step needs to be through WTO and IMF and other international bodies, but we're not even taking that step. So thank you very much.
Well, whoever I may really be, right? You can call me Brown. And I want you to know that under that name, in the next 8 minutes, I'm going to completely dispose of two topics. One is I'm going to balance trade in the United States, and I'm going to motivate the creation of high-value jobs in the United States. I'm going to allocate roughly 4 minutes to each. How am I going to do this? Very simple. I will listen to Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett is a very good guy. And he has proposed that U.S. exporters should receive certificates when they export for the value of what they export. They export $5 million worth of stuff. They get $5 million worth of certificates. They then put these out to sell on an open market. The importers of goods need the certificates. They buy it on the open market. They can only import $5 million if they buy $5 million. All right? That took less than 4 minutes to balance the trade. Now this might be a little abrupt for some people who are currently importing into enormous quantities and which are not balanced by anyone's exports from the United States. So I am willing to bend a little bit on this thing and soften the impact by issuing, say, in the first few years, more certificates than the export value, but we'll sort of tighten it up as we go along. And in fact, in the version that was introduced in the Senate by Senators Dorgan and Feingold, they do exactly that. And there are many ways, right? But in spite of the sort of lighthearted way I'm discussing this, I regard this as a deadly serious, workable proposal if properly softened. Right? P. Peterson really talked in some sense about lack of discipline or lack of sacrifice. This is one really simple, straightforward way to impose discipline. And I think we should just go ahead and do it. Right? Everyone will always raise the issue, is this thing compatible with WTO? And we've had long conversations with very good trade lawyers on that topic. And they think it is. It would have to be made temporary, but that doesn't matter. That's fine. Right? So what I'm saying is, folks, we talk about this, that, and the other thing. But if we're deadly serious that we need to do this to balance trade, and I think we ought to be, because it exacerbates all the problems that we're dealing with. Now, the lack of competitiveness, competing with a very, 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 very undervalued currency. Right? This is something we have to just stop standing around and start doing something. And here's something to do. And I think it goes, in typical Warren Buffett fashion, it goes right to the heart of the matter. This one's just slightly more complicated. However, the way to start with how do you motivate high-value jobs? Empirical thing. Well, what do other countries do? Right? What do other countries do to motivate the creation of high-value jobs? Well, as far as bringing in foreign facilities like, disk drives in Singapore, they get special tax treatment. They build facilities for them. They supplement the wages of the workers. They make it attractive. Now, what does that mean? To make it attractive, and why do they do it? Right? And here we come to the fundamental issue, which has been alluded to some extent, very briefly by previous speakers. Countries want and need high-value added jobs. That's what your GDP is made up of. On the other hand, companies want profits. That's what they are in business to create. And the deal that is struck is that Singapore is offering what will make you profitable if you bring into their country the high-value jobs which they want for their country. So we have two different kinds of entities here. Countries wanting high-value add, companies wanting profits, and they strike a very sensible deal beneficial to both. So Singapore is incenting companies to go in there to make profits, and it makes sense for Singapore to do that. But let's keep in mind, these two creatures have different values. All right. They are company goals, which are profitability. They're country goals, which is we want to create high-value add jobs. How do we turn that around now and do that in the United States? We are not capable. No one, I think, would dream that we do not have a bureaucracy, we have not tradition of a bureaucracy that will make deal by deal with individual companies come to our country or stay in our country, and we will give you a special deal. Right? And you will stay here and make disk drives, or semiconductors, or you name it. And I'm also including, of course, services. Right? But we do have something, to an extent that many other countries do not, and that's the corporate tax. So we have a way to align the corporate tax rate with the average value add per U.S. employee. And that, in other words, if you are a very productive per worker company in the United States, you will pay, and I will really simplify, just about no corporate tax. And if you're below the level, you will pay a hell of a high corporate tax. And that will motivate you in every possible way to try and be productive per hour work. The only way you will ever make money is if you're high on that scale. You'll make it, but it'll be taxed away. This could be made revenue neutral because you'll go up on the unproductive companies and down on the other ones. Many variations of this are possible, but basically we should seriously consider many ways to use the corporate tax rate How do I get rid of that thing?
Escape.
What?
Escape button on the top left.
Escape?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. The corporate tax rate represents something that gives us enormous leverage over companies. And we should use it to motivate them to do what we want them to do, which is, as I just said, low for high value add and high for low value add. Now, this is not really new because, as you just heard Rob say, this is already being done in the R&D tax credit. The R&D tax credit is a way to lower your corporate tax, right, which in the end means also tax rate, and for doing what society thinks you ought to do, which is do more R&D because you don't capture all of it, etc., etc. And I'm saying, well, I think that's in the right direction. But why should we tell them what to do? Right? For some people, more R&D is right, and for some people it isn't. I think in general it's a good idea. But why not aim at the thing we really want? Why not aim directly at the goal? High value-added jobs. If a company can lower its tax rate by innovating at every level, not just the R&D level, but with ingenuity in how they sell, with ingenuity on the manufacturing line if they manufacture stuff, with ingenuity in the way they respond to incoming calls. And if they can get the work they used to do done quicker and more efficiently, they're adding to the GDP. And let's reward them for that, not just if they do it on a science basis. Right? So I think we can say the R&D tax credit is definitely a step in the right direction, but it's a step that suggests that we should not limit that incentive to scientific and technical areas. We should rather let companies invent their own way to the goal which we all want, which is high value-added jobs. And this will incent them to do just that. Thank you.
Thank you all. That was very stimulating and also to time, which is even more remarkable in this day and age. So I have a few questions from the audience. If there are more, please send them up. We have a goodly amount of time for discussion. I guess I'd like to take the prerogative of the chair and ask a couple of questions. One, Ralph, to your presentation, how would you deal with the transition costs that are both economic and political? For example, if you were to, in effect, raise the corporate tax on low value-added companies, it would encourage or incentivize them to move abroad faster than they already are. One could envision, apparel companies and other things who would say, look, we can't add there's not much value to add here, we've got to move. And that would create a political backlash, it seems to me. So how would you deal with that?
Well, look, there's no way you can increase productivity if you just leave all the low-producing ones alone. So you've got to get an incentive to improve, and if they can't improve, they
Right, speaking if you could, yeah.
there's no avoiding the problem. You have a low-producing person.
It's on, it's on.
Ice cream is on.
Let me test. Does anyone hear me? Okay. I got some nodded heads, even in the farthest corner of the room. Okay. So the problem you point to is unavoidable. And so the question is, how do we tackle it? And first of all, you tackle it gradually, so that you give people a chance to adjust. But secondly, I am quite optimistic that I have very, very rarely seen any where if it's being done with lots of low-wage workers, you can't do it differently. Automation, robotics, all those things are really real. And because the way we dig ditches, it's with backhoe. If you looked at a gang of 20 or 30 people digging the shovels, you might not, and that's what you're used to, you might not think that's a backhoe. But someone has to. And if the pressure is on, that will bring about that direction of change. And if it isn't, if there are two ways to do something, I've seen this over and over. If you can do it with a lot of cheap labor, or if you have to step back and take a chance, invest capital, invent something, you're going to go the first way. We'll remove that.
Also, I think what I like about the idea is that it incentivizes people not only to invest in science and technology, but also in management. I mean, to adapt advanced management techniques. Vinny, I want to ask you a question. I want to press you on your argument that the best trade strategy at this juncture would be to more aggressively use the dispute settlement mechanism in the WTO. It seems to me the problem with that approach is that the dispute settlement mechanism has become captive to corporate interests in the United States. Cases are pursued or not pursued depending on the self-interest of individual corporations, not necessarily the national interest. Politicians will tell you that they're not about to pursue a case unless the industry involved is willing to support them politically because of the political problems in pursuing a case. Now, it's simple enough to say, well, politicians should be high-minded and bureaucrats should be high-minded, but we know from experience that they're not about to do that. So how do you get around that problem?
I think that's a good point, but this is hardly a new problem that trade policies benefits particular companies. I mean, if we look at all of the voluntary export restraints, steel, textiles, electronics, Semiconductor Industry Association pressing for opening of the Japanese market, it's always been particular corporate interests. I think what we see recently is this new development where a large-scale effort is being made in the DSM to actually take China to the DSM on intellectual property issues, using the TRIPS agreement of the Uruguay round. And I think that is, of course, it may benefit certain companies more than others, but I think that's a very general approach to dealing with the problem, and much better than just simply opening up markets in one or two sectors. I think generally going after the lack of protection of intellectual property in China is a very good issue to pursue.
It's an excellent example, except we haven't filed the case because the companies are getting cold feet.
Well, there are two ways to look at that. One way is that the companies are also trying to broaden the argument before they file the case.
We have a number of questions from the audience. The first, I think, will be directed at Susan. Susan, what does Congress and the President need to encourage Dow and similar companies to redouble their U.S. investments? As a corollary to that, what kind of immigration policies do we need to meet your needs here in the United States?
That's a good question, and I hope you don't quote me on what I say back to my Chief Executive Officer, but I think probably doubling our investments, not within question, but maintaining our investment in the U.S. is certainly something that I think is very much in the company's best interest. Let me just mention that about a third of our sales are in the U.S., about a third are in Europe, and about a third are in the rest of the world. So having been headquartered in the U.S., we already have a significant investment here. But I'd say in terms of what the President and the Congress could do, there are a couple of things that are important to us. One would certainly be addressing the very serious problems that we see in energy and feedstocks. And it's a very serious problem for my company because we get dinged twice when the cost of oil and gas goes up, because not only affects the cost of energy that we use in manufacturing, but oil and gas are also our feedstocks for chemical products. So I'd say probably top on our list would be addressing the issue of availability, supply, and cost for energy. Another issue that we're concerned about would certainly be the extension of the R&D tax credit, because in order for the U.S. to continue to be an attractive place for us to do R&D, we feel that that's an important component for us. And then also I'd say many of the things that were addressed in the American Competitiveness Initiative are very important to us, including more funding for research in the physical sciences, which are not only important to a chemical company, but they're really foundational for biomedical sciences and other things that are important to the country. With regard to immigration, I feel that probably the most significant issue from our perspective has to do with the highly educated workforce that we employ for R&D. And the United States has certainly, in the past, was very successful at not only attracting the best and the brightest students from around the world, but also allowing them to stay and pursue careers here. With 9/11, we saw that became much more difficult for the best and the brightest from other countries to enter graduate school in the United States. And many of them have now chosen to stay at home, not only be educated at home, but seek their careers at home. So I would say that making it more attractive or easier for the best and the brightest foreign students to pursue their graduate education in the U.S. and then remain in the country and work in fields like research and development after graduation would be important for us.
Actually, the next question from our audience, I think, is an excellent follow-up to your last point, because it's a skeptical question, and I'm going to aim it at Rob because he's the only one here who has a long-time Washington resident. But it's a little bit off your expertise, but as a Washingtonian, you're going to have to answer the question. One of our participants here in the group has asked the panel, has said, look, these are all very fine and wonderful proposals you've all made, but we have a political process in this town that seems to be broken in terms of addressing them. Susan's point certainly about immigration is eminently arguable, and I would certainly support it myself. But in the current fervor, anti-immigrant fervor in this country, even increasing the H-1B visa program has proved difficult at times, and there's certainly opposition to a substantial easing of that program, let alone other immigration approach. So, Rob, the question is, what do you think are the key political obstacles in this town to trying to get some of these fairly sensible ideas into law?
I think my answer is going to reflect the fact that I work at a think tank. But I actually believe that the first step in all of this is winning the intellectual fight. And I think if the intellectual fight were won, this whole debate would be significantly easier. As I said earlier, I don't even think we have agreement that there's a problem. I think there's a whole swath of neoclassical ideologues in Washington and a lot of think tanks I could name who will say that the trade deficit is not a problem or that the trade deficit is our fault. And it's just simply, if we just saved more, it would end, and why are we worrying about all this other stuff? And those people are quite influential in economic policy making. So, that's probably as unrealistic to expect them to change as it is to expect the Republicans and Democrats to, work well together. But I think that's the first problem. I guess, although maybe on the political part, I'm not as pessimistic, I think, on the political side in the following sense. I think H-1B actually we will raise that. I think we'll do something on the R&D tax credit. I mean, I think you do see Congress is a slow-moving animal, but eventually it gets up to speed and it starts doing these things. And they're not as fast as I think most of us would like, but I do think that in the next 2 or 3 years we will certainly see movement from where we are today. We're just not going to maybe see as much as we might like.
There was a second question about the political atmosphere in town here, and I guess I'll try to answer it just because it was, I guess, initially directed at me. One of the folks out there, who everyone remains anonymous, pointed out that increasingly in this town we have a self-interested group of corporations that do business in China. Unlike the 1980s, when we had trade tensions with Japan, and I know from my own personal experience, if I wrote a piece that was critical of Japan, no one from the corporate community called me up to complain. Some might call up to support the idea. But today, if you write a piece critical of China, the first reaction comes from American corporations who do business in China saying, well, you really don't understand the problem, and we really can't do anything about this, this China issue. So, and that, it seems to me, is reflected back in the political process here in this town, that you now have American corporations arguing a different side of this debate than we did in the 1980s. It's a natural outgrowth of our investment and and companies that are dependent on imports from China as well as trying to export to China. But it does seem to me that it complicates the political process. Maybe it makes it more real, but it certainly complicates it. Would anyone on the panel like to comment on that challenge we face? Rob?
I mean, I think that's absolutely right. But I don't think it's as dire, though, as you say. I think one of the things that will happen with the Democrats taking over the Congress is they're going to want to do something, and I think enlightened business leaders know that. And the question then, if you are an enlightened business leader, is to give them something to do. And I actually think there is a sort of, if you look at it as a Venn diagram, there's a nice overlap of things that are in both parties' interests. One of them, to me, is these very unfair trade practices. I mean, the Microsoft getting sued in many, many different countries, standard setting being done to keep U.S. technology products out of countries, forced offsets. If you want to sell in China, you've got to open up an R&D lab, and I know that takes place. And I think certainly IP theft, which is rampant. 70, the Chinese government is stealing software. I mean, so I think on all of those cases, there's a fairly close synergy, and the problem has been we just haven't had any kind of trade enforcement in the last few years. Seems to be ramping up a little bit now. So I would see over the next couple of years, you could see a lot more being done there that both parties, if you will, in business and government could support.
Ralph, you were shaking your head. Do you have something to say on that particular issue?
Well, I think I really agree with the fact that this is a problem out there.
Okay.
It's still not those.
Evolution of the companies, and there was a reference made to Sam Palmisano's article sometime back, which essentially said, we're not a U.S. multinational, we are a global corporation, we'll do this, that, and the other thing. Right? And so I think it's going to complicate the relation of companies and countries in just this sort of way, which is companies will be dealing with each country from the viewpoint of the company and not of the country. And the countries have to wake up to the fact that when they're talking to names like IBM, which they think of as American companies, and give us some good advice about how we should do this, that, and the other, they're not talking with an organization that has the same goals as the country does.
We have a question, Ralph, this is really a question for you, based on your book, Global Trade and Conflicting National Interests.
Yes.
One of the participants here asks a question that saying your book has been interpreted at times as an attack on free trade agreements and the World Trade Organization. How do you think international trade should be conducted going forward? I assume that means should it be through agreements in the organization or in some other way?
I'm not an expert on how to reach trade agreements, but I will comment on the book on which I am a recognized expert. The book is entirely in favor of free trade. And my personal observation, and it just says, look, let's assume we have free trade. We're for it. Not having it is worse, right? So let's have it. But the book does point out that in a free trade environment, if your trading partner industrializes rapidly, that can have a real negative effect on your country. That has nothing to do with free trade at all. In fact, one of the things that I find most discouraging when I come to Washington and talk with people is I say, look, the industrialization of Asia may have a negative effect even in a free trade environment. They can't hear that. They immediately start talking to me about the Doha round and this. And there's a confusion between the impact of a changed world in which there are many plants and call centers that weren't there before. That's an impact. The conditions of trade are an impact. But they'll only talk about the conditions of trade. They won't look at the reality that's out there that's new and changing and different. And that's what we need to look at.
Susan, one of the issues that you didn't mention in factors that determine why a company like Dow might do some production or even research and development abroad was the existence or lack of intellectual property protection. Now, clearly, you have many things to mention. It's not as if you don't care about that. But one of the things that's always struck me is that you will hear companies come to Washington, complain about a lack of intellectual property protection, press USTR to do something about that. But the financial or political incentive to cite that R&D abroad overwhelms their concern about the threat to their intellectual property. Now, that's a calculation a corporation makes, obviously, and it may well be that the gains outweigh the potential losses. But it does seem to me the country has to worry about whether the corporations are actually making the right decision. Now, I'm not suggesting the country should second-guess the corporations, but if you could talk a little bit about the internal calculus of that and how one thinks about that inside the company.
Well, actually, the intellectual property protection issue is an important one, and it fits in that innovation environment that I mentioned as one of the factors. And as you already said, Bruce, often, or at least in the case of a country like China, the tremendous economic advantages of having this access to a rapidly growing market and basically growing the size of your sales is such a strong incentive that companies like mine, I think, well, we definitely would like to see intellectual property protection improved in China, and we feel that that's very important, and we would support appropriate actions to make that happen. But at the same time, we're kind of pragmatic, and so we find workarounds. So how can we do R&D in China without losing important intellectual property? And there's some things that we do, for instance, which would be maybe not to do the whole thing in China. But there may be pieces that are done in the U.S. where we feel we have the ability to protect the intellectual property, and other pieces are done in China, so that it's the whole picture, it's the aggregate that gives us the competitive advantage. But for instance, we probably wouldn't do everything in China. So I think my company for sure, and I believe many other large ones, are finding these sort of temporary workarounds which allow you to deal with the poor intellectual property protection that currently exists, and hope that that situation will be rectified in the future.
Can I add?
Sure.
I just want to add a point on negotiations, which I think we haven't really talked about, and maybe I should have talked about, which is that it's quite clear that the Chinese are not protecting intellectual property, and other countries are not as well. But it's also true that there's no neoclassical trade when it comes to agriculture trade. And a lot of these countries would like to see the American agriculture market opened up. We actually have a mercantilist policy in agriculture, whatever else you might want to call it. We have subsidies. The Europeans have butter factories going in Europe. And a lot of this stuff is what negotiations is about. So in the Doha round negotiations, that was precisely the discussion, that these countries need to provide intellectual property protection. But for our part, we need to start getting rid of some of those agricultural subsidies. And that's what I was referring to when I said that we've undermined the coalition for free trade by pursuing these bilateral trade agreements. We don't have a broad-scale coalition that says, okay, we'll open up our markets, and if you do that. And traditionally, for the last 50 years, we've been very successful at building this kind of coalition. And so the other aspect of the fact that we cannot seem to make progress in negotiations is this trade-off that we're unwilling to make.
Okay, I have run out of questions, and we have run out of time, and we are on time, which is an amazing thing. Our next item on our agenda are summary remarks by Kathleen Kingscott and Kent. Kent, do you want to come up here to do that, or how?
Why don't I do that?
Yeah. Okay.
Just wanted to mention that Taffy Kingscott called and was just unavoidably detained. I guess the congressional phrase would be necessarily absent. So she very much apologized and wanted me to remember her to all her many good friends who are here. Bruce, thank you very much, and thank the panel. This was, again, stimulus, and I'm pleased that we could finally match real food with a multitude of food for thought. But what I would like to do is just, before we go into the roundtable discussions, just briefly summarize, or briefly as I can, what I heard this morning. Just really not certainly as the final word by any means, but simply as a way of relaying a basis for your discussions. I thought that it was terrific to open with Senators Bingham and Alexander, who, as they mentioned, really had taken the lead in prompting the national academies to articulate a series of challenges that we face, and in addition, pull together groups of people who would suggest responses and in turn have a blue ribbon commission pull those together in a compelling report, one that strikingly has received so much bipartisan cooperation that, in a sense, they're attempting to provide an answer to one of the questions posed by Secretary Peterson. Can we deal with the gathering storm, not the storm that is immediately hitting us today? My fingers are crossed, but they really have taken that particular set of proposals a long way. In terms of Europe, I heard really Europe and Japan, I heard a lot of pessimism, maybe more than I would have articulated myself. There was a sense that Europe was lagging in research and development, and that they were actively looking to adapt the U.S. system to their own conditions. That labor flexibility was a problem outside of the Nordic countries. That one of the interesting steps was the focus on regional clusters. That the Michael Porter kind of thinking really seems to have swept the world. Ireland was an interesting example, and what I didn't quite hear from Gary was how they made up their mind to make that decision. That it was, he emphasized embracing of the Washington Consensus. I think, like India, they also built on a system of higher education, which was very high quality. So as they started to attract companies on a macro basis, they really had the high-level human capital to match it. Mark Tilton reminded us that Japan is, in many ways, still mercantilist. They're very focused on protecting the island economy. That in doing that, they're really focusing on modernizing established industries. Steel was the example that Mark picked out. Here we have had a lot of modernization, but it's been in a very painful process and involved a great deal of shrinkage. That Japan is aware that it's slipped behind in IT, and it's very intent on keeping pace with IT. And what I heard in terms of the future was that they really are making serious changes in their higher education system. That, again, I think much of the world has been looking at what works well here. They certainly don't want to adopt our failures, but they're looking at what works well here and seeing if they can't in some ways match it, including encouraging a closer collaboration between universities and business. When we shifted to listening to the rising powers in Asia, China, Carl Dahlman reminded us, has had a series of really stunning achievements. And I think the achievements are well known. They're well covered in the financial press and frequently on the front pages as well. A little less attention has been paid to China's aspirations, which really are stunning. You will hear people talk about their desire to have 1,000 University of Michigans, that is 1,000 large, high-quality research universities. Their desire to be able to produce their own PhDs and not depend on having to send them to Europe or the United States. They seem to be driven very much by a sense of rediscovered greatness, desire for independence, and of course the need for stability. I think Carl mentioned that they have been shedding 15 million workers a year, urban workers, from the state-owned enterprises. There's more of that to come, as I understand it, and that doesn't, of course, take into account the rural sector, where you will hear people talk about as many as 150 million semi-permanent workers moving from city to city. In India, TN reminded us that India had started late, 12 years later than China, driven by a crisis. It has now really opened up and was well positioned to take advantage of changes in the IT world, where the economy was going digital. There was enormous available array of international broadband capacity, and they really have taken advantage of it. He also reminded us that in terms of global market share over the last 30 years, they've lost in terms of manufacturing. My sense is they do very much have their eye on China, and that is prompting them to begin to make some of the policy changes that I think he would approve of. Brian talked a bit about these Southeast Asian economies. We don't focus on them as much. He looked about a growing really digression, as I remember he put it, a divergence rather, between Singapore on the one hand, which is actively moving up the value-added chain, and Malaysia and Thailand. Thailand that seem to be caught on the one hand between the low manufacturing costs of China and the more innovative pace being set by Singapore. It makes me think of how you will hear Mexicans say that they're caught between China on the one hand and India on the other as they look for a strategy to move forward. I thought it was very interesting that he suggested there were some possible lessons there, not so much for the federal government here, but for our state governments. The same was true, I thought, of Mark's comments about Germany, where it was the lender who were really taking the lead, and you do see quite different initiatives taking place around our states here. The last panel, which was very stimulating in terms of the variety of proposals about how we ought to think about responding to these opportunities and challenges. Vinny reminded us not only in the course of the panel about the complexity of negotiations, but also cautioned us against relying too much on a particular economic model, reminding that the economic model really rates maybe a proxy for a particular interest that's being pursued, or he didn't put it quite this way, but in talking about strategic trade theory, it became a very powerful way of thinking about the world, but in some ways it was a lagging indicator. It was really explaining what Japan had already been doing. Susan, I thought, very nicely reminded us of the complexity of factors that go into a corporate decision. And she looked at a series of questions, including labor, and then talked about one of the questions that we all wrestle with, which is the qualitative dimension, including a climate for innovation, something that state governments also here think a lot about. Rob usefully reminded us, really, I would say, of the heart of the long-term competitiveness agenda, which is often used as a synonym for long-term productivity growth. That a lot of that depends on domestic factors. He also sort of painted a both promising and cautionary picture of the future. Would the United States be really like New England, or would it be more like the Great Lakes? Or you might think in another context of, let's say, Cleveland, which is doing very well on the medical side, but has very fine universities that produce innovative ideas, but they're not commercialized in Ohio, or let alone Cleveland. They often find themselves being exported to Austin or Silicon Valley or Route 128. And I think the question Rob was posing was, is that going to happen to the innovative capacity in the U.S.? I want to say that he did endorse the supply-side approach in the sense that is emphasizing the kind of things that are rising above the gathering storm, but emphasized you really need to look at what our goal of doing all that is, which is to create innovation and investment in high-quality jobs in the U.S. And we have a creative idea about how to do that. Ralph Gomery started off with trying to present this in a simple way. There are really two very dynamic ideas, one focusing on the trade and current account deficit. And just just to show you how long I've been around Washington, I want to associate the Buffett idea with Senator Russell Long. In the 70s, I remember Secretary Schultz testifying before the Senate Finance Committee, and Russell Long was very focused on what then seems like a minuscule trade deficit, and he said, well, Mr. Secretary, I've got blacks, I've got Cajuns, I've got rednecks down there in Louisiana, and they're worried about jobs. What if we just hand out a ticket to everyone to buy something from us, and then they can sell something from us? So I think the heart of that Buffett idea has a very, very distinguished predicate. But again, I think, and the interesting piece on that front that Ralph pointed out, that this has already also taken the next step and been introduced as legislation. I would not predict that it will pass next year, but the kind of legislation that's going to start stimulating very productive debate. Ralph, like Rob, focused on this question about how do you incentivize high-quality jobs here in the U.S., suggesting the use and the more creative use of a series of tax incentives, but then also laying out a number of possibilities that we might think of. Well, let me stop there. This, as I said, is kind of what I heard. Hopefully you'll find it useful. And I'd like now to break into the discussion groups. And we have a number of discussion leaders. Maybe if they could just raise their hands and distribute them, make sure they're distributed so we don't have 3 leaders at one table. Maybe you 2 gentlemen could distribute yourselves and fill in the tables to make sure. Connie, we might you can all kind of move them up and fill in the tables here. And then what we're hoping that you do with our discussion leaders is reflect on what you've heard and see if you can each come up, each table can come up. Connie, as an example, will report to us on what you, 3 things you think we ought to do.
I gotta run. I'm getting this off.
Oh, okay. All right.